Thank you for the opportunity to debate this controversial subject. And just as one point of clarification, I'm not even a physician. I am, in fact, a statistician from background. So I don't know how I got in here at all. Anyway, at the dinner last night, I was told very much that this is a highly intellectual society, well-read and well-knowledge. So as a show of hands, how many people know what this painting is? Yeah, they also said there'd be 2 or 3 liars as well on the side too. No. This is a very famous painting. It's Escher's Waterfall. And what Escher's Waterfall does is it challenges you to ask, is the water flowing up or is the water flowing down? Now, the statue of David, it challenges you to ask, is it Bernini or Michelangelo? Of course, Boris Johnson asks, Prime Minister or just a high flyer? And of course, the reason that we're here today, are we talking about surgeons or are we talking about robots? And actually, the answer to all of those questions depends on one thing: perspective. But whose perspective are we talking about here? Are we talking about patients? Well, they've got questions about the patient journey, treatment choices. What will the robotic treatment feel like? What are my chances of being cured? Are there any consequences of the robotic treatment? We've got you guys out here just now. Questions about clinical effectiveness. Which robotic treatments have the best outcomes for my patients? And what's become clear to me over the last 24 hours I've been at this conference, time and time again, you're all asking, are we being innovative? The manufacturer clearly needs to know, does the robotic system work? They're going to ask questions about the balance of cost to production, of cost of production to potential sales. And of course, things like questions, what will the shareholders say? And in fact, we just observed that about 2 minutes ago in the previous presentation. There are more. What about the health service managers? Well, they're now more interested in issues of local priorities and needs. Of course, they're looking at cost effectiveness of specific healthcare treatments. How should services be delivered locally? How can they be organised the most efficiently? And we can keep going on, because now we're into the policymakers. Well, of course, they're taking a societal perspective on the use of robots and asking, well, what would be the impact of those decisions on the health and wealth of the nation? But you might have observed across all of those perspectives, there is in fact a commonality across them all. And it is, does it work and what are the costs? That could be the cost to the individual, the costs to the organisation, the cost to society. So what's the current situation? The manufacturer rightly encourages surgeons and hospitals to adopt the technique. It is, after all, their job. The smaller hospitals, we've just heard, they might not be skilled at laparoscopic surgery. They're targeted because the robotic system is purported to shorten the learning curve. And once the Da Vinci has been purchased, they then move on within the hospitals to market quite aggressively, in some cases, the benefit to patients. But we're not naive. This is life. This is the world that we're living in. So what's the problem? Well, the robotic system is expensive. We know it. It's £1 million plus a maintenance charge. And in fact, this adoption has occurred in the absence of rigorous evidence. And in fact, it was demonstrated in 2010 that 89% of centres in the US that publicise robotic surgery make a statement of clinical superiority. Not equivalence, clinical superiority. And so now I'm going to self-publicise, because in the last 2 weeks I've just published and just come out a large evaluation looking at the relative clinical effectiveness and cost effectiveness of robotic prostatectomy compared to laparoscopic prostatectomy in the treatment of localised prostate cancer within the UK NHS. So it's a UK NHS perspective. I'm not going to tell you very much about it. It was a systematic review of the most robust studies that were done. There were 19,000 patients across 58 different studies. The studies were generally rubbish. But, you know, you could nevertheless do something with it, and I'm going to cut straight to the results. Here's the summary of effectiveness for robotic prostatectomy versus laparoscopic. This is a meta-analysis forest plot. The left-hand side of the dotted lines favour the robotic prostatectomy, and the right-hand side favour laparoscopic. And as you can observe, there really is quite strong evidence that for robots, the odds of a positive margin, an anastomotic leak, and an organ injury appear to be reduced when using the robot. However, there's absolutely no evidence really out there that the odds of the important patient outcomes, these are recurrence, incontinence, are actually reduced when using the robots. What about the evidence of the learning curve? Well, let's have a look at those 58 studies. That's a lot of patients, a lot of data out there. If you have a look along here, along the axis is increasing experience of the surgeons undertaking laparoscopic and robotic prostatectomy. And you'd be expecting to observe a curve, a decrease in the number of positive margin rates. Well, clearly the answer to that is no. But you say, I know that there are a lot of really, really large case series out there. What do they say? Well, indeed, there is some evidence out there, as you could see. There are not that many points on the graph, but there's some evidence that, in fact, positive margin rates do get better as experience is gained. But there's a critical fact here, that according to the literature, there is no evidence that the rate of learning was different between the laparoscopic and the robotic procedures. So the purported argument that the learning curve is getting shortened on important patient outcomes actually isn't really there when you start to scrutinize them. Okay, so that's effectiveness. What about cost effectiveness? So for cost effectiveness, a model was used to simulate outcomes and costs. Do this by using a predefined care pathway for the individual men, and that the transition of individual men along this pathway is really driven by things like the previous health states, etc. What does that actually look like? So part of a pathway looks like this. And so in here, what you get is a man is eligible to have the procedure. They move through the pathway to have an intervention. There's then post-operative assessment going on, and then they end up either in a surveillance state or a cancer treatment type state. Of course, that is a simplified. For every rectangle on that graph, there are things like, for example, the post-operative assessment would look like this, with PSA monitoring, etc., embedded within it. And what else do we need to know? Well, we need to know about the patient's health utility. So utility can be thought of as a sort of measure of quality of a patient's state. It's got a large history. Utilities have been measured in health economics for decades and decades now. So it's on a scale from 0 to 1. If you're death, you start at 0. Post-operative state at 1 year, cured, you've got a utility of about 0.9. If you have a systemic recurrence, of course, it's a bit of a catastrophe for your health utility, and that is reflected with a score of about 0.42. And just as a sort of interesting note, biochemical recurrence, which is in fact just a transitory state before a full diagnosis is made, actually has a very substantial impact on the patient's utility due to the uncertainty at that time. So lots and lots of studies have been done to generate all these figures. You want to know the bang for the bucks. So here they are. I'll lead you through it very, very quickly. Say you do 50 prostatectomies in your institution. The mean marginal cost between doing that is double using a robot. But you do have what's called a slightly better quality adjusted life here. And that means that on average, when you do all of this work, just using the robot, that your men will have slightly longer, they'll have slightly longer good health than if they did not undertake it. But you think, what does that mean? And that's why I show you the last one. So the last one would say, for you as an institution, how much does it cost to give a man 1 extra year quality of life, good quality of life? It's £106,000 using the robot, additional to laparoscopic for an extra year, per patient. Of course, 50 might be quite small, so maybe 200 is a bit better. So at 200, the mean costs are sitting, of course, they get closer now because your volume's gone up. So it's closer, and that's reflected in, well, it only costs an additional £18,000 for the robot per person. That's a hell of a lot of money on either way for training surgeons. So what do we know now? The robot likely can improve clinical outcomes. I'm not saying it can't. It'll always be more costly to the NHS, though, compared to conventional laparoscopic surgery. But the high usage can offset a lot of those costs. But there's little chance, certainly in the UK, that there are enough patients to maintain that level across many centres. There's potentially a lot of money to invest in trainees, but all these results were dependent upon one factor. Does a difference in the positive margin rate actually translate into recurrence? And why is this relationship crucial? There's very little data in the literature to actually support what is the relationship between the robot or the laparoscopic studies. So of the 24 studies that reported the methods of measuring positive margins, every one of them used a different method. So the robotic literature has been driven by surrogate outcomes, not important patient and clinical outcomes. Now, you don't need me to tell you guys what the dangers are of using surrogate outcomes. The most famous example is the CAST trial from late 80s, early 90s, where flecainide reduced the surrogate outcome, cardiac arrhythmia, as intended, but it actually increased mortality in the process. So to quote Mark Twain, the researches of many commentators have already thrown much darkness on this subject, and it is probable that if they continue, we shall soon know nothing at all about it. So avoid the darkness. Instead of investing in robots, invest in and develop talented surgeons, because that is what drives innovation, and clinical benefit is already proven. Thank you.